Hi, I wonder if some of these things will resonate for you. Are you the world's best kept secret, always struggling for your message to be heard? You constantly overcheck things, making sure you're perfect at every word, frequently stand on the outside looking in, wondering if you'll ever belong. Stand alone all too often because you've learned that's how you've made yourself strong. Does that sound familiar? Get excited about new things, but the novelty doesn't last. Distract yourself with the little wins because the big ones seem such huge tasks. Start your work close to deadlines because that's when you get your best work done. Constantly overwork yourself so you miss out on all the fun. Got some of that too? Get easily overburdened because you've taken on too many tasks. You want to be relieved of your load, but you're too afraid or ashamed to ask. Prefer to work alone because sharing means that you can't claim your full worth and you can't see these patterns that you're running are costing you the earth. Hello, I'm Sharon Lovegrove, and I work with high-functioning professional women who are stressed, overwhelmed, and depleted because they're trying to do and be perfect. And I empower them to reclaim back control, reset their negative mindset, and recommit to living their life joyously as their perfect, imperfect self. So, if you experienced any of what I mentioned up there, if any of it resonated for you, you probably have imposter syndrome. And I know when I wrote this poem, I wrote it about me. And so I'm guessing that you probably would definitely have imposter syndrome. And I want you to know that there's nothing ever to be ashamed of, right? But what I've talked about here is just a tip of the iceberg of what imposter syndrome can do. And I can tell you, imposter syndrome can affect every part of your life, every part of your life. So if none of that's resonating, there will be other things that will resonate once you start to explore imposter syndrome. Okay, well, I didn't know that I had imposter syndrome until a few years ago when I was writing my second book. And in the middle of writing that book, I was finding out a little bit about how to promote my book, and I had this dreadful feeling. And I realized I would not promote this book just like I had done with my very first book. Yeah, which was 4 years prior. And when I spoke to the person that was working with me, she kind of said, "Ooh, that sounds like imposter syndrome." And I said, "Imposter syndrome? How can I have imposter syndrome? I'm perfectly confident. I talk all the time. I go on videos. I have clients. I stand and I do normal talks." Nah, I had it, but I just hadn't really seen how I had been limiting my life. I was living in a land of delusion, really, until I stopped and had a look and really thought about why didn't I promote my first book that I had had rave reviews about for all those people that had said it had changed their life. And here I was, not promoting it. It didn't make sense. And now I'm thinking and worrying that I won't do this one that I've spent so much time with and also so much money. And not to promote it, it seemed ludicrous. Yeah. So, yeah, that was really what I started to do. And what I found out about imposter syndrome was realizing that I was overcome by this paralyzing fear. And that fear meant that I was always feeling a fraud, because most of the time I couldn't really let anybody know who I truly was. Yeah, I couldn't show that who I was, because I was ashamed of myself. I was ashamed of myself. I was ashamed because when I looked at what I expected, where I would be, I wasn't. And when I compared myself to how everybody else was, yeah, I wasn't where I needed to be. And this made me feel more and more ashamed. So I also realized that many people, when I asked them questions, they didn't think that I was feeling what I was feeling. When I'd say I feel uncomfortable or I feel something's going on, they'd say, but you're confident. We see that. You know, I still didn't feel it. This was the crazy thing. This was the crazy thing. So thankfully, I did a little bit of research and I found out what imposter syndrome really is and what sits at the hub of imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome, just by definition, was first claimed by Clarence and Eames in the 1970s, 1978 in fact, and they named the research the internal experience of phoniness, of intellectual phoniness. And that should give us some idea what imposter syndrome is. It's the feeling of a fraud, but it's a cognitive mental issue. All right, it's a cognitive mental issue, and it really is about not really being a fraud. All right, it's the feeling of being a fraud. Right, so you're probably already doing the work that you've been doing for many years perfectly well. You probably are perfectly capable and have lots of qualifications, but you might still feel this terrible anxiety every time you go for a job, every time you try and put your foot out, every time you try and stand in front of a crowd, every time you try and do something, every time you ask for your prices, every time you say, hey, you should come and work for me. Yeah, this is what it was. This is what it was. Right? So even though you know and you can go through everything, you realize that in actual fact, when you get to that final bit, it's hard. It's hard. And that's what imposter syndrome is about. It's like you have this glitch inside of you that doesn't stop. It doesn't stop. And it keeps you trapped and stuck where you are. So it's a really strange condition. According to Big Think, 70% of women will experience at least one bout of episode of imposter syndrome in their life. And of that 2/3, 1/3 probably isn't going to recover easily. And I call that real imposter syndrome, right? That's the real imposter syndrome. And I say that because most people, everybody will move into different areas in their life and they'll feel a little bit shy. They might feel a little bit out of sorts. They might feel a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit fearful, but they get over it. They get over it pretty quickly, pretty easily. But there's this other group that doesn't, and that doesn't. And it's that group that is the group of women that have serious imposter syndrome, right? So we know, who gets imposter syndrome? Well, I've pretty much told you imposter syndrome can happen to anyone in the planet, men and women. But it doesn't affect everyone equally. Right? And the reason it doesn't affect everyone equally is it has to do with our sense of safety and our sense of belonging, our sense of having our place in the world. And what it's about is about the fact that a lot of people in different social or underrepresented groups, they feel often are made to feel less than, all right, because of a cultural background, because of what's going on, because they're a different group. We have an in-group, out-group kind of phenomena, and that really does set this feeling of somebody being above and someone being below. So they feel that if they move outside that remit, they feel like an imposter, right? But those groups are really particularly susceptible. But I'm going to say 1/2 of the world's population, when they move out of traditional roles, so women, I'm talking about here, and we move outside of traditional roles and move more into a masculine orientated world, then all of a sudden we experience imposter syndrome because we're not in the role we were expected to do. And we're still expected to hold those roles at the same time of doing this other role. And that means we get pushed and incredibly stressed. So that's why half of women with imposter syndrome probably are going to experience a lot more uncertainty, and certainly 1/3 will. If you are in environments that are very aggressive, competitive, separative, divisive, anything where you've got people not feeling safe and not supporting each other is going to create an imposter syndrome. And also where you might be thinking, might have a different thinking pattern or something like that, which is kind of like an artistic person trying to get into, say, for example, trading. It might be a challenge because one is intellectual and one is more arty. And those two worlds often are different in their way of planning and sorting. So we know who gets it. We know that everybody can get it. But why doesn't everybody get it? Right? Why doesn't everybody get it? And I think people don't get it because of the kinds of traumas they experience and the way they are supported in their life. And so this is really the key. The key is that as a woman, you have spent a lot of your life having to probably look after people. So part of the traditional role is a caretaker role, right? Very undervalued. And yet it holds the whole of humanity, but it's because it comes naturally and it's easy and it's very undervalued, unfortunately. And so what happens is that when we go into roles that are different, we start to not value these roles in the same way and we get stressed out. And having to move in those roles really shifts how we are with ourselves, right? And when we've developed and grown up being valued for what we do, being valued for what we do. Women are only good enough because they're caretakers. Women in traditional roles are not really always thought of as highly as men. And that's always been the case for a long time. And I don't think that's necessarily caused because of men. I think it's because, in actual fact, if we think about someone doing something time and time again, we get used to it and we take it for granted. And I think that's what happened. Men went out into the forests or went hunting for days, and then they'd come back and boy, they had meat. They were tired of eating vegetables and berries and things like that, right? Now they had meat, so the men got celebrated. And so somehow or other, their status increased and women's status didn't. And this means that when we moved into the world of acceptance, we started valuing ourselves on what we were doing. And when we value ourselves on what we do rather than who we are, it means that sometimes when we don't get to do what we need to do in order to get value, we lose out. We lose out. Because guess what? We are not superwomen, right? We're not superwomen, and therefore we cannot be perfect at everything. The balls will drop eventually. So there are many other things that go on with imposter syndrome and very different ways in which things happen. But what I do know is that one of the key things that we've got to do is work with that sense of value so that you can learn to be in that place where you know that you are enough and that you are valuable without having to prove or be anything else. That's what we have to do. And that's how I can help you. That's how I can help you. I'm not saying that this is going to be short work like that. It isn't, right? It is going to require you to learn skills and to learn to connect back to yourself so that you can begin to learn to trust yourself, to listen to yourself, to feel those inner connections with yourself that you've been kind of trying not to feel because they've been painful, right? And learn to love yourself, to come home to yourself and to belong to yourself because you have that right to belong to yourself. Because you are okay just because you have been born. That's it. And if you are not okay just because you're born and you feel you don't belong just because you have a right to exist because you've been born, then there is some work to be done. There's some work to be done. And imposter syndrome is when we can't see ourselves for who we truly are. Perfect and imperfect at the same time, and gorgeously lovable because of that. Our imperfections are what allow us to be the magnificent human being that we are, because it's our imperfections that let us help others. It's our imperfections that give us the ability to have grace for others. It's our imperfection that makes us learn how not to be arrogant, but to be compassionate. It's that imperfection. If we embrace it, we can find and become the full presence of ourselves. So if what I've said has resonated for you and you would love to have a call and find out how I work, book in for a call. It's a free call. And what we'll do together is we'll go through and see how I can help you. It's about 20 minutes, if that. And if we can work together, I'll tell you how to do that. If we're not a great fit, then guess what? I will pass you on to somebody else that I know that will be able to help you. That's a promise. That's a promise. So if you like what you've heard, if this has resonated for you, then please book in for your call. I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you for listening.